good crisis. This webinar is brought to you by Boyden China, Boyden Singapore, and Boyden Australia and New Zealand. My name is Victor Filamor, and I am a partner of Boyden China and Singapore. My colleague Marie Evans will be managing the webinar's logistics. Boyden is one of the largest retained executive search, interim management, and leadership consulting firms in the world. Today's webinar will be led by Barry Bloch, who is a partner of Boyden Australia and New Zealand's leadership consulting practice. Barry held executive and non-executive roles across the public, private, both listed and privately owned, and not-for-profit sectors. He was previously head of organizational transformation at Monash Health, COO, project support at BGC Contracting, Group Managing Director for People at Worley Parsons, Global Practice Leader for Leadership and People Development at Rio Tinto, Non-Executive Director and Chairman for 2 private sector businesses, and Board Director for 2 social enterprises. Barry worked in senior leadership roles in global professional services firms, where he successfully led and delivered numerous board and executive level individual, team, talent, and organizational development and effectiveness assignments. Barry holds first-class bachelor's, honors, and master's degrees in industrial and organizational psychology from the University of Cape Town. He is a member of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Thank you again for attending our webinar. Over to you, Barry.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you to everyone for joining us. So as you've heard, my name is Barry Bloch, and thank you, Victor, for the introduction. Let me just add that, in fact, at the moment, I'm not only the partner at Boyden Consulting, but actually continue to be on the executive team of Monash Health. Monash is a 19,000-person public health service here in Australia. I also, for those of you who are from Australia and New Zealand, you'll recognise that we start our meetings in this part of the world by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. For me, that is the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. For those from other parts of the world, that's a really important part of our cultural identity in Australia and New Zealand. So I hope you don't mind me following our cultural protocol. In terms of the agenda today, I'm going to ask Marie to move to the next slide. And let me just take you through what I'd like to cover. And we've had the introduction. I'd like to just explain a little bit more about why I believe COVID-19 has fractured our society, because it's critical to the fact that we then live in chaotic times. And in fact, the chaotic times have existed prior to COVID. So in fact, what we'll cover is somewhat of a discussion around where is the chaos coming from? Because so many people would wish that there were not chaotic times. I will propose to you that trying to turn off the chaos is not actually the strategy. The strategy is finding new tools, new skills, new mindsets. And the 2 that I'd like to introduce you today, the one is our ability to challenge our uncommon nonsenses. And I'm going to explain to you a model and a framework that I've learned and advanced, but you'll see that I also would like to source 2 professors. One is Professor Jules Goddard of the London Business School, and the other is Professor Rod Anderson, previously of the School of Business of the University of New South Wales. So they both helped develop a lot of this thinking in the past, and I've been applying it across global organizations for a while, but it becomes more and more relevant. The second area after uncommon nonsenses is I'd like to introduce you to the concept of swarmware. We often use what I will call clockware. You will recognize it when I describe it to you, but focusing on swarmware and especially on the idea of a few simple rules and a good enough vision. And there will absolutely be time for questions at the end, although if you've got questions as we go, please do feel free to ask. And please do type them in at the bottom, as Victor said, and we will absolutely endeavor to answer all of them. And then after questions on the hour, we'll seek to close off, and I'll be passing back to Victor. Before I move to the next slide, let me just explain why I believe that COVID-19 has fractured our society. And as an organization transformation practitioner and as an organization psychologist, my observation is that the psychological impact of COVID-19, both locally and globally, and pretty much in every single part of the world, is as dramatic an impact as we have seen on the world since the world wars. No other event, no other crisis, no other scenario, no other situation has had such dramatic impact at every level of society. It has impacted us socially, it's impacted us culturally, it has impacted us technologically, it's impacted us economically and organizationally. And in fact, the level of fracture in society is so dramatic that where we see societies coming out of COVID outbreaks and lockdowns, we see quite dramatic increases in mental health issues, both in terms of acuity of mental health, but also in terms of suicidal ideation and activation. We see dramatic impacts on the models of employment and the models of economy and the models of business. So the fracturing that COVID has created is as dramatic as anything that we've seen in any of our lifetimes, anything since the Second World War. It's with that precursor that I'd like to actually talk a bit about the chaos that the world has been facing for a long time, and then to add to that, explore the chaos COVID overlays. So if you don't mind, Marie, moving to the next slide, what I should say you would have seen on the previous slide, but don't switch back, is we'll also be using polling. So there'll be 3 polls throughout the presentation, and at each point you'll have about a minute, you'll get a prompt for a poll on your screen. Please do participate. Please do give us your insights and your inputs. We'd love to hear what you think. So even before COVID-19, we were living in a chaotic world. It was really, whether we were in the economy of Singapore, the economy of China, the economy of Australia, the economy of London, the economy of New York, we've been facing a dramatic increase in these factors. I'm not going to go through every one in detail, but certainly we've seen some very dramatic economic pressures. We saw the GFC, and that impacted most of the world. We did see certain countries cope better or get through it better because of primary industrial sectors. But certainly the economic swings and roundabouts have been very dramatic over the last decade to 15 years. Societal norms and expectations have shifted, again, very significantly, often driven by social media, often driven by access to technology, and often driven by that whole global home and family experience that we now have. At the same time, we've seen across the world increasing need for regulation, both domestically and internationally. And that regulation is applied not only to our financial disciplines, it's applied equally to, for example, our science and clinical disciplines, and it's certainly applied to the whole arena of international crime and things like corruption. So we're seeing dramatic increases there. Seeing organizations having to find new ways to operate, partnerships, alliances that we would never have expected before across industries that have never collaborated before. Our demographics have shifted on a global basis. In the developing world, the aging population in the underdeveloped world, or in the developed world, the aging population in the underdeveloped world or the developing world, we've seen the younger populations. We've also seen increasing international diversity at local levels in many, many parts of the world. In the area that my one organization operates, we have over 162 different nationalities of the approximately 190 plus registered by the United Nations. And that whole demographic shift is playing out all over the world. We're certainly very aware of the political context. We've seen this both nationally and internationally. We're certainly living through quite dramatic political dynamics right now in a number of parts of the world. We've seen quite a shift in how politics is playing out, and it is certainly impacting our organizations. I'm not going to go through everything in too much detail, but you'll see the impact of technology. We've certainly experienced a dramatic change in the role of media in shaping society, shaping economies, shaping leadership. And we've seen both national and international labor relations pressures. And with that, a lot of competition for resources and ultimately significant global uncertainty. So our world before COVID was chaotic. So in fact, some of the tools that we're going to talk about today that I've built on from Professor Goddard and Professor Anderson absolutely applied pre-COVID. But Marie, if you don't mind moving to the next slide, let's acknowledge that in addition to all of that, along came COVID-19. And COVID-19 fractured our society. It has put an immense magnifying glass on all of those other factors. And it requires us as leaders of organizations, whether we're leading in the private sector or in the public sector, whether we're leading for purpose or for profit, it requires us to reflect on how we lead and how we shift the way we lead, and in fact, quite significantly change our mindsets. And what I'm going to be proposing to you is two fundamental shifts in mindsets and providing you with two key mindset tools to challenge the own way you lead. Before we do that, though, we're actually going to do the first poll, because it would be interesting with the participants we've got on this webinar call to get a sense from you, which of those critical elements that I've described, including COVID, has been the most dramatic in terms of creating chaos or challenge in your organization. So Marie, if you wouldn't mind launching the first poll. And there you go. So what is your most significant external business challenge? You'll notice that we've got 10, Zoom allows us to do only 10. Please, and you can scroll down. I'd like you to just press on one. It'd be really interesting to see what has been your most significant external business challenge. I think if I understand right, the poll will be available for a minute. And then when it closes, then Marie, you'll post it up on the screen. So just take a moment to do that, and let's see what's been going on for you and your colleagues on this call. Marie, just confirm if you can that people are actually collecting and adding in their thoughts, and just let me know when you'd like to launch it and that's going live.
They are. We've got 12 out of 15. So as soon as we hit everybody, we will.
Fantastic. So if everyone wouldn't mind just typing in, and then Marie can launch that for all of us. And it's just for us to get a sense for ourselves, what's going on in the world of the participants that are here. And Marie, if not everyone does it, are we still able to launch the data? Just in case someone's struggling to do it technologically. There you go. So if we actually look at it, what's interesting, quite a broad range of external business challenges. But COVID, interestingly enough, and we have only a small sample of the 15 of the participants, but COVID-19 is still the largest single one there. But we're seeing quite a broad range, and this is very, very important. The tools that we're going to discuss today, so we're going to close that down, and we're going to move on. The tools we're going to discuss today absolutely apply if your biggest challenge is COVID-19. They equally apply if any of the other factors are the ones that are leading you to be on the edge of chaos or to be in a chaotic time. So I'd like to introduce you to the first tool. And the first tool, if Marie, you'd move to the next slide, is quite a busy picture, but allow me to take you through it. And I use this a lot. I've been using this very recently with a disability services organization that works with the learning and intellectually disabled and provides both residential care and employment opportunities to create genuine independence. And we've been challenging the organization in these difficult and chaotic times. So down the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see on the axis what we believe to be true. And there are things we believe to be true that are actually true, and there are things we believe to be true that are no longer true. And if you look at the two circles, the one circle on the left represents your organization. And there's a circle on the right that represents your competitors. In terms of coping with chaos and leading and competing well, this is the analytical tool. Let me explain it to you. So where you believe things to be true that are true, and your competitors believe things to be true that are true, We're dealing with what we call common sense. And often you'll hear the colloquial term, it's just common sense. In strategic terms, and in terms of making strategic decisions, common sense is actually that which we both, you and your competitors, know to be correct and true about a marketplace. So for example, we may know that the growth rate in the marketplace is X%. We may know that the marketplace may be divided into key subsegments. And we all know how to play. That which is common sense is simply the license to play. Gives us no strategic advantage, and it gives our competitors no advantage. It's what we have to do that they have to do. There are things in an industry where we believe something to be true that our competitors also believe to be true, but in fact, we're all wrong. And this is the place where the industry can be fundamentally challenged. These are the common nonsenses. I'm using the term nonsense not in a pejorative and judgmental sense, but allow me to use it as a term to define that which is false, that we actually think to be true. So it is not sensible. And this is, for example, one of the classic examples for this is what we heard from Big Blue in the 1980s, where they believed that the personal computer, there would never be a need for more than 20 of those in homes. And everyone that was a big player believed that PCs had no future. And then obviously along came the likes of Apple, and they destroyed the old industry. And it took a long time for some of those organizations to recover. My very first job was as a computer programmer with Wang. Wang didn't believe in the personal computer. Wang does not exist anymore. So the common nonsense is that which we and our competitors believe to be true that are not true. I'll give you a practical example from the COVID world. In the COVID world, you will find that many in the healthcare sector, especially those that provide hospitals, believe that you need bricks and mortar to provide healthcare. Well, what we've learned in COVID is that's a common nonsense. In fact, to give you a very practical example, in the health service that I've got the privilege to be working, our Women's and Newborns clinical program, this is who deals with the pregnant mums and expectant mums, has moved over from under 5% to over 66% of all expectant mums to telehealth, with no negative impact on clinical quality and safety. So the challenge there is not to see the nonsense. The challenge is to say, well, actually, hospitals don't need to be physical buildings. And in fact, we've seen many, many examples where the health services have had to challenge the common nonsense that can destroy the industry, that healthcare is in a hospital, or that tertiary healthcare is in a hospital. Then, of course, we need to look at where we get our strategic advantage. And this is really where we want to play as organizations. This is where we get the benefit in a chaotic world. Now, where we see things to be true that our competitors don't see them, we have what's called uncommon sense. So again, the new entrant to a marketplace that actually believes that something is true and none of the existing entrants believe to be true, and they take over the market, they have uncommon sense. I've had the good fortune for 6 years until recently to be the chair of an online private sector organization that is a community for the over 60s. There was a very strong belief across the industry that over 60-year-olds did not want to go online. And I was fortunate enough to meet the founder and CEO, and she had a very strong belief that over 60-year-olds did want to go online. They did want to be connected. They wanted to do it safely, and they wanted a single source site. Over the 6 years, Starts at 60 has become the largest single source site for over 60-year-olds in the world, and has been able to therefore build a Travel at 60 organization. Again, and I'm not trying to market the organization, a strong belief by the travel industry that the service and the products that can be provided to over 60s are no different to those that are provided to the under 60s. Starts at 60 is a good example of having uncommon sense, and it's given them competitive advantage. So I put to you as executives, are you clear on your uncommon sense? These are the things that bring you competitive advantage. The other really fundamental question, and the one that is incredibly difficult to break in organizations, and where I want to focus on next, is the uncommon nonsense. These are the things that you and your organization believe to be true, that your competitors believe to be false, and your competitors are correct. So in other words, these are the mythologies in your organization. You may believe, if you were in the mining sector, that the best way to compete was to have long life, low cost, high grade ore bodies. That was very much the model of the mining sector and of the very big players on a global basis for a long time. Long life, low cost, high grade ore bodies. What we've seen in that industry, we've seen new entrants come in with high grade, short life mines, or high grade, high cost mines, but when the market is up. And we've seen a number of the large competitors who believed in long life, low cost, high grade ore bodies, we've seen them struggle to regain their competitiveness because their uncommon sense has led them to a certain way of mining and a certain way of practicing. For those of you in the industrial sectors like mining, there has been the same way of mining for over 100 years. I can remember actually reading mining instruction manuals from when one of the largest open cut pits in the world was formed in 1904. And then comes along the idea of the driverless vehicle, or the personless mine, remote operation centers. And the organizations that believe that you have to be on site to mine lose their competitive advantage. So what I suggest to you as the first tool is to actually be facilitating with your leadership teams to map together, are you clear on what the market's common sense is? Are you clear on therefore what your license to play is? That which is true that you all believe to be true. Are you clear on the common nonsenses, the industry destroyers, the industry destroyers such as the personal computer example, the industry destroyers such as the over 60s do not want to go online. The common nonsenses where we and our competitors believe it to be true, but it's actually false. And that's important just to allow you to stay relevant, but it doesn't give you competitive advantage. And then facilitating with your executives and your organization as a whole, a clarity of what is your uncommon sense, which is your true competitive advantage, that which you believe to be true, that others believe to be false, and you're correct. And for example, for those of you in the not-for-profit sector, I would argue that not-for-profit is an uncommon nonsense. In fact, we should be for purpose and for surplus. And I see organizations, I work with a number of organizations in that sector who've shifted from the not-for-profit mindset to the for purpose, for surplus mindset, and it's giving them significant competitive advantage. It allows them to look at sources of revenue and sources of service and sources of customer and consumer base that those who believe they are charities not-for-profit don't find. So I encourage you to do that. And then lastly, and most importantly, what are your own organization's destroyers? The mythologies, the beliefs, they're sometimes known, and forgive the metaphor, as the holy cows. But those elements that you believe to be true that are actually false, that our competitors are taking a completely different view, and our culture doesn't let us challenge it. And with that, I'd like to now just swing to poll 2, because poll 2 really asks the fundamental question about the uncommon nonsense. And it'd be interesting to see how difficult it is for you in your organization to challenge the uncommon nonsenses, those mythologies, those deep beliefs that could be driven by yourself as an executive, by yourself as a chief executive, by yourself as a chair, by yourself as the HR director, could be driven by your whole executive team. But Maria, if you don't mind putting poll 2 up. So how difficult is it for you and for others, but let's answer it for you, to challenge your own organization's uncommon nonsenses? These are the things you believe to be true that are actually false in the marketplace and are a competitive disadvantage. And especially in chaotic times, really, really important to challenge these and challenge these quite hard. So it might be that we actually believe that telehealth is bad for clinical quality and safety. Well, in fact, the evidence is proving the otherwise. So let's see what the poll says in the next minute. I'll give you a moment to put it up, and then we'll move on to the second tool. And the second tool will be the introduction to you of Clockware and Swarmware. But we will make the connection using the common nonsenses as a way to introduce you to Clockware and Swarmware. So Marie, when we've got enough of a poll, and in fact, the Clockware and Swarmware will also give you a tool by which you can actually constructively challenge your own organization on its nonsenses. So again, it's interesting. No one finds it easy. And we find 27% find it slightly difficult, but it's actually over 70% of us have quite a lot of difficulty challenging our uncommon nonsenses. It's a really important segue.
I'm sorry, Barry, you're recording, your sound is.
Sorry? Hello? Sorry, Heidi? Sorry, Marie? Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Barry.
Okay, sorry, I got some sort of prompt there, but I don't know what that was. Okay, we're going to move on. So let's segue using this concept of common sense and common nonsense, uncommon sense and uncommon nonsense. With our strategic objective, if you think about the circles, we want to expand the uncommon sense and we want to shrink the uncommon nonsense. We want to create more competitive advantage and shrink our competitive disadvantage. And if at all possible, by doing that, we want to move the circles apart and create an even smaller place where there is common sense, because that makes it even harder for our competitors. So think about moving your circle to the left and turning it more into a completely, not a circle anymore, almost an oval, but with a heavy weighting above the line. With that, I'm going to ask Marie if you can move to the next slide. Because one of the biggest uncommon senses one of the biggest common nonsenses, are we able to switch to the next slide, Marie? Marie, yeah, there you go, thank you. So one of the nonsenses in a chaotic world is we think that out of chaos, we have to make things practical and simple. In reality, how many times have you been in an organization that tries to simplify things and creates this sort of penknife? So if you look at this picture, now this is the Swiss Army knife with every possible gadget. In fact, there is a complete mythology that practical and simple is necessary in chaotic times. By trying to simplify things, we often over-engineer them. By trying to simplify things, we actually, by trying to turn everything into a simple structure, we end up creating such complexity that we actually really do make things chaotic. So there is a nonsense about change that says that it's critical to make things practical and simple. I'd like to introduce you to an uncommon sense, if you don't mind, Marie, moving us to the next slide. And I'd like to propose that we can truly thrive on the edge of chaos. And what we are learning more and more is that organizations that really don't try to simplify it, really don't try and put some sort of control around everything, and actually operate well in that zone between order and disorder, are far more successful. I love the term that I was introduced to by Professor Anderson, where we actually love the sense of being in a state of permanent almost foul. So if you think about if you've walked down the street and you've tripped over an edge on the pavement and you've almost fallen, but it gives you momentum to move forward and you regain your balance, but you've actually moved really fast to your next place. So the state of almost foul is a hallmark of thriving economies and healthy organizations. And it's the most productive change, that edge of chaos. So we shouldn't try and shut the edge down. We shouldn't try and control everything to, and dot every I, cross every T, make everything absolutely black and white. We need to be poised in that act of almost falling. Now, that's quite a confronting thought for many organizations. When your organization, when your teams and your people say to you, oh, Barry, can we just slow the change down? Can we please calm everything down? Can't we have a period of no change? Can't we have a period where we just actually bed things in? The most successful executives use that to then move us another step, create another step of almost fell, putting us continuously on the edge. Now, we're not going to go over the edge, but we are going to go on the edge. So the second common nonsense, if Marie, you don't mind moving to the next slide, is that we then believe, based on the first common nonsense that we need to simplify things, we then believe that we need to manage and control everything in our organizations. And we put in huge risk management frameworks, and we put in huge technology controls, and we put in all sorts of other systems and processes, and committee after committee after committee, and delegated authority documentation after delegated authority. It sounds logical, it sounds rational, it sounds practical, it sounds standardized. But if you just look at that dashboard on that airline, what we're asking our leaders to do is to fly something that's complex all the time. What we end up doing is we create so many dashboards, we create so many gadgets, we create so many different ways a leader is meant to lead that it actually makes things harder to lead. She, he, or they really then struggle to engage with their people. But we keep trying, and every time it doesn't work, we'll add Clockwork. But the world is not actually designed on Clockwork. And I'm going to move us to a really fundamental, quite a difficult or challenging thought, is that, in fact, nature has actually proven that Clockwork is not the way many, many things operate. So if we move to the next slide, thanks, Marie, you actually start to see, and again, I need to credit my original sources, that you'll actually see that, the way a river moves is not by Clockwork. And if there's a huge thunderstorm, it's not Clockwork that puts the river in its place. You can put all the Clockwork in place. You can put every single possible control. For those of you who've got children, I've got the joy of 2 of my own sons. They are very, very special and dear to me. But had I tried to put Clockwork in their place, I couldn't guarantee how my children would turn out. We can't anticipate what the share price of Apple will be this time next year. There are too many uncertainties in our world, how people behave. We are 7.2 billion people or more. Each one of us is human, first and foremost. Each of us brings individual identity. Each of us brings individual psychology. Therefore, we bring unpredictability. So Clockwork doesn't work for so much of what we lead. We can't control our organizations to success. We can't control our organizations to greatness. We need to introduce a second tool. And the second tool is on, Marie, if you wouldn't mind moving to the next page. And I'm going to spend the rest of the time just talking about Swarmware. But really the concept is that we need to introduce Swarmware. And the concept of Swarmware, again, comes from nature. If you think about how bees swarm or another swarm, they don't have Clockwork in place. And if there's something terrible and traumatic going on, they have a few simple rules that allows them to keep moving forward and survive and succeed. So they really do, these are the organizations that love the complexity, the ambiguity, and love the disintegration. And they find ways to move the disintegration to new opportunities, new challenges, new possibilities. They use experimentation, intuition, they take risks, they incubate, they explore, they pioneer. They really do break free from the Clockwork. Now, I'm not arguing that Clockwork shouldn't exist, but I am suggesting that the more chaotic the times are, the less likely Clockwork is going to be a successful leadership tool. So in times of major growth, in times of major change, when the environment is uncertain, we need to look to Swarmware. So let me explain what Swarmware is on the next slide, Marie. And Swarmware is really about 5 simple factors. And I want to especially focus on number one, and I'm going to spend most of the rest of the time on the first. We sometimes try and create these perfectly wordsmithed visions, and we try and create this huge manual of rules, our codes of business conduct. But in fact, if we look at nature, when they face huge chaos, nature has only a good enough vision and a few simple rules. So I'm going to give you two very quick examples from nature. I'm not suggesting, and the one will be from the world of termites, and the other will be from the world of flocking birds. I'm not suggesting that we should be that, but it should give you a quick sense. So I'm going to ask you, Marie, to move to the next slide, and then we'll bounce back. So if you're termites, and by the way, this is true for those of you who live in the likes of Africa and the likes of Australia and New Zealand, that's a termite mound. Now, how do termites survive when you have major changes in weather conditions? Their good enough vision is simply that reproduction requires protection, food, and constant temperature. That's all that they have as their vision. We need to keep reproducing. We need to keep the termite population going. And they only have 5 rules. That's the way they run. So if you're a termite, you're out looking for food and you get separated from the colony, start a new colony. Don't try to find your way back. The second rule is the shortest route from the colony to the food, mark it up. The third is build a mound in the direction that minimizes heat. Remember, we need to be constant temperature. Number 4 is when you see danger, let everyone else know. And number 5, if it gets too hot inside your termite mound, make another hole. I'm being a bit simplistic, but it's actually quite important to start to think about it. And please, I'm not suggesting as human beings we're termites. But if you think about your organization, what are the simple rules? If we take COVID, for example, there are really only 3 fundamental rules to protect ourselves around COVID. So what we know is that so if our goal with COVID is that it doesn't disrupt society, we know that COVID, and this is the medical piece, we know that COVID is transmitted largely through close contact and droplets. So number 1, stay far enough apart. Now we're hearing across the world there's a certain distance. Number 2, cover your face. And number 3, keep your hands really clean and don't touch your face. Those are the sorts of, now there may be 1 or 2 others, but if you actually think about it, there are a few simple rules. Now we have in society tried to introduce Clockware. We've tried to introduce Clockware. I'm not making it all a political statement, but there are a few simple rules and a good enough vision to organize as an organization, whether you're in manufacturing or in mining or in healthcare, whether you're in the public sector or the private sector, a few simple rules for us to get to the other side of something chaotic. What are the few simple rules if we were to actually get to the other side of a global financial crisis? Just to give you a quick second example. The second example, Marie, if you wouldn't mind. So if you're a flock of birds that needs to migrate, the simple rule, the good enough vision is survival depends on us doing this together. Survival depends on co-migration. So what are the rules? Number 1, we must all fly in the same direction. Number 2 is we must always steer towards the center of our mass of birds. That means we don't break apart. At the same time, we need a certain distance between us, and we all have to fly at the same speed. And if you look at these, and you can see groups of millions of birds following a good enough vision and a few simple rules, and for generations and generations and millennia, no matter what happens when they hit typhoons and they hit huge weather chaos, they still survive and succeed. So the reason I wanted to take you through that is, I know it comes from nature, it's a bit weird, but a good enough vision and a few simple rules becomes crucial. Just quickly, I'm going to cover the other 4 factors. So Marie, if you wouldn't mind going back 2 slides. Now, if we go back 2 slides, you'll see that on the x-axis, we have things where, it's about the level of certainty. If your organization has a lot of certainty, it'll be down on the far left. If it's far from certainty, it's on the far right. If your organization can agree on how to respond, that's in that lower end. And if they can't agree how to respond, it's higher up. Now, we do need Clockware, but we use Clockware where we have certainty and agreement. When we are certain of what the future looks like and we are agreed how we're going to get there, let's put in Clockware. Let's run the projects. Let's get the project disciplines. Let's run risk management. The moment we move far from certainty or far from agreement, Clockware works less well. And that's where the first and critical Swarmware tool of a good enough vision and simple rules kicks in. The second is really, so if you can't get agreement in your organization and or you're far from certainty, welcome the unpredictability. Encourage people to be paradoxical. Encourage them to learn on the run. And in fact, if you go right back to, for example, what Shell did in the early 1980s, encourage them to learn by having fun. Enjoy the unpredictability. You know, what have we got to lose if we actually pioneer and experiment? We also think that information needs to be controlled in Clockware. In Swarmware, we open up the information. There are often specialist support functions that say we have to hold back information from our people. Now, there are a small number of things that obviously we have to be very cautious of. If we list it, there are certain pieces of information that must be tightly controlled, obviously respecting individual confidentialities and legal dynamics and acquisitions and deals. But most information can be liberated, can be opened up. We can actually create a lot more freedom in the information that allows us to really together make decisions as if we're the flock of birds. Because if we all have the same information, we can figure out how the few simple rules are working. And then we encourage the innovation. We encourage, and we set up the fast fail mentality, which has become quite common, and it's starting to prove that fast fail in Clockware will actually fail. Fast fail in Swarmware tends to succeed. And relentlessly keeping your organization on the edge. So every time people ask for it to slow down, think about the next step. Keep people on the edge. Now, I obviously want to acknowledge that we should look after the well-being and mental health of our organizations, but at the same time, we can do that and stay on the edge. If we don't, the chaos will overtake us. So Clockware is about routine and system and process and deadline and measurement and metric. And Swarmware is about that whole area of good enough vision and a few simple rules. That alone is important, but it requires us to challenge our uncommon nonsense and through the good enough vision and few simple rules to create a new uncommon sense. With that, Marie, I'm going to go to the slide with the poll 3 on it, please. Now, I would suggest to you, therefore, that we need both Clockware and Swarmware. But we'll talk about your organization in a minute with the last poll. But my suggestion to you is that where you've got certainty and where you've got agreement, Clockware works. But where you don't have certainty and where you don't have agreement, Swarmware is needed. We did a lot of work with the head of innovation of Rio Tinto, who then became the head of innovation for the Snowy Hydro project in Australia. And John McGrath actually was outstanding in terms of how he enabled the organization to use Swarmware early and Clockware late and introduced that whole concept. So I'd encourage you to think Swarmware plus Clockware. If your organization is very strongly Clockware and you are experiencing significant chaos, I'd suggest that Clockware alone becomes your uncommon nonsense. It becomes your competitive disadvantage. With that, Marie, if you wouldn't mind putting up the third poll. Because the third poll is, what do you, in your organization, given your current external business challenges, what's more important to you strategically right now? Is Clockware more important? Is Swarmware more important? Or are they equally important? Given what you described earlier, which would be more valuable to your organization now? I'll just wait a minute for Marie. And then after that, we'll look at your results. And Victor, I'll just close with with a summary, and then I'll hand back to you and we can do Q&A. So really, really interesting. None of our organizations see Clockware as more important. There is absolutely a third, 3 out of the group, or 30% of the group, who see them as equally important, and 70% who see the Swarmware as important. So our challenge as leaders, and I'm going to move us on, if you don't mind, Marie, to the last slide, before I hand back to Victor. So the challenge for us as leaders is that in these complex, increasingly complex and demanding times, traditional leadership is insufficient. In the face of the current economic crisis, in the face of the current social crisis, in the face of the fracturing of our world, as leaders, you and I cannot use our traditional models. We cannot use our existing belief in what is true. We need to challenge our nonsenses. And we can't just have common senses. We need to find the uncommon senses. And to do that, we need to be courageous, so we don't waste the crisis. This is the opportunity for organizations to truly thrive. We are seeing some doing some extraordinary things. And I used the example like moving to nearly more than 2/3 of our expectant mums to go telehealth without any negative impact whatsoever on clinical quality and safety. Really, really exciting. And there'll be many, many examples of that. But this is the time for us as leaders to have courage. It requires us and our cultures to move beyond thinking we work in a scientific way. So we challenge the science of the known, and we seek to really embrace the art of the unknown. And to do this, we need to challenge especially our uncommon nonsenses. What do we believe to be true, that others believe to be false, and others are correct? And we need to move from leading change with Clockware, especially in the early phases, to really driving transformation through Swarmware, and especially through the use of a good enough vision and a few simple rules. With that, Victor, I'm going to pass the baton back to you to facilitate questions.
Thank you, Barry. A couple of participants texted me directly. A question came up. Well, let's first read the question from Neil in the chat box. What companies or industries have successfully adopted Swarmware?
So, Neil, you'll see a lot of this in, and I don't like to just quote the obvious ones, but you'll see a lot of this in the technology world. And in fact, you'll see certain countries adopting Swarmware stronger. You'll see the likes of the Irish economy, you'll see the likes of the Israeli economy, and please, I'm not making comments on any single economy where Swarmware is being applied and it's leading to greater pioneering and innovation. You're seeing it in technology. We are seeing it in R&D. We're seeing it in biotech. We have seen it in the evolution of remote operations, the use of drone technology. So we're seeing those break down the uncommon nonsenses and really challenge whole industries. So we're actually seeing quite a lot of exciting work. What you might conclude, though, is the organization needs to be younger and newer to do it. My biggest challenge is the organization that has been in an industry for a long time. And those are the ones, so if you're part of an organization that has many, many decades behind it, your challenge as a leader is to be even more courageous. It's easier for a new company to use Swarmware. It's essential for a long-standing company to use Swarmware. Sorry, I'm seeing part of the question, Neil. So maybe, Victor, you can read the follow-on question from Neil.
Barry, can you give us an example of where a few simple rules and a good enough vision has been applied during the pandemic?
So I just answered there's in the chat from Neil says, how is success measured? Success is measured by the performance of the company outperforming its competitors. In very, very simple terms, are we seeing growth in market share, growth in profitability, and recognition by our stakeholders and shareholders? The measure of success of Swarmware should be not just the survival and sustainability of the company, but the growth of the company. And then obviously, if it's a not-for-profit, the service of, or the for-purpose, the service of its community. So with that, let me come to Victor's question. So I have absolutely, in terms of good enough, of simple rules and a good enough vision, let me give you a very, very simple practical. I've worked with a manufacturing organization for the last 18 months. They operate across 3 continents and many countries. One of the things about their culture has been the casual conversation. One of the things that has really driven them has been the ability to connect informally. So the good enough vision has been to retain the level of informal connection across the company, because that's where their innovation has come from. This is in the packaging industry on a global basis. That's where their ability to respond to the market has come from. Most of their best ideas have not been in R&D. They've been through the connections, and the connections cross-continental. So a few simple rules. One of those simple rules is, if we're all working virtually, we're all working from home, we're all on WebEx. What they actually did was they created, with their IT platform, whether it was WebEx or Zoom, they created an open coffee and kitchen area on a global basis. And the simple rule was, if you're going to grab a coffee in your own home, and it's during work hours, log into the global kitchen. So log into the global kitchen was the rule. And if the CEO, who's based in one country, was going to get a coffee, and the CEO happens to be he in this case, happens to be wearing shorts and a t-shirt, he would walk into his kitchen and he would immediately log in. And he could be there with a manufacturing employee, a blue-collar tradesperson with a tradie certification, and that person would be logging into the crib room somewhere in the United States or somewhere in Asia, and they would just chat. So really, really powerful. They started to come up with some whole new solutions, in terms of packaging for the health service industry. So their packaging was more food and beverage, but they've actually started to come, but it came up through the coffee conversations in the kitchen. So the good enough vision is, we will stay as connected as we ever have. And the simple rule is, if you're grabbing a coffee in your kitchen, you will log in to our joint kitchen. No, they don't police it. They didn't put Clockwork in there. What was amazing is that people started to actually meet even more people. That's just a practical example, Victor, a very small one, but it's generated some really interesting innovations for that organization right now.
Thank you, Barry. I believe we have time for one more question. How can an organization build Swarmware into its organization, Barry, if it is so strongly focused on Clockwork?
So there are 2 fundamental points. The first is, what are we doing as leaders? How are we role modeling? How are we behaving? What are the questions we ask? So the first thing is, look at your leadership, look at yourself, look at your colleagues. Do we have leaders who ask questions about innovation? Or do we quash innovation by reprimanding people who make a mistake? Do people get punished for the idea? Do they get celebrated for the idea? It might sound simplistic. And what are the myths in the organization? Do people talk about when Barry squashed an idea and shouted at someone in a meeting? Or do they talk about the celebration? So again, I'm really, really fortunate in our organization of 19,000 people in the healthcare sector. We since the start of COVID, have been running twice a week employee forums and once a week management forums. But we celebrate innovations in those. Every week we've celebrated at least one team, so much so that other teams are saying, can we tell you about ours? Can we tell you about ours? So that celebration, that role modeling. The other area, Victor, is to the person who's asked the question, is systems and structures. There was a period where we tried to set up innovation in incubators outside the main organization. The greatest problem with that is the main organization culture swamps it. It smothers it. And then we thought, well, we'll buy innovation, we'll buy a company that's innovated, but the culture smothers it. I'd encourage us to look at innovating in the core. So that the old model is innovate outside the core. But what we do is we innovate in the core in small ways. One of the biggest things that squash the Swarmware is budgeting processes. So look at your budgeting process. Are you holding people to account for cost, or are you holding people to account for growth? Are you holding people to account for the present? Are you holding people to account for the future? So a lot we can do.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you for a very insightful presentation. Marie, if you could put up the last slide. If you would like to ask Barry questions, further questions about the presentation today, do email us. Do email me, do email Barry. Our email addresses are flashed on the screen, or contact your Boyden consultant. Contact your Boyden consultant or us if, in addition to executive search, you require solutions on leadership coaching, leadership team development, strategic facilitation, culture change and facilitation, and finally, talent management and development. Again, thank you for attending the leadership webinar today. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Victor.